Thank you for the floor. Our Human and Social Studies Foundation has studied the Russian propaganda and the populist discourses in Bulgaria for many years yet. But I decided not to present the data about the dissemination of the Russian narratives here, about the networks and actors. We have such data, and you can see them in our newsletters and reports. They are very close to what Susanne presented to us about Germany. There are, of course, differences, but there are much more similarities. But I decided to make some generalizations on the basis of our research up to the moment. And something as a manifesto essay I wrote, a manifesto at least for my approach to the subject of this forum. So, the title is The Global South Against the Collective West, Do We Have a New Discursive Front? Over the last decade, attempts to geopolitically challenge the hegemony of the West have become increasingly aggressive. Russia's war against Ukraine is the most dramatic example, yet still only one of the examples. As Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe wrote back in 1985, the struggle for hegemony is always discursive, or informational, symbolic, and so on, we could say today. Because, as Neville Bolt also insists, politics is not merely an external clash of forces, but also a constant struggle for discursive redefinition of the positions of those forces in the field. Therefore, the question here is, will the actors contesting the values of liberal democracy succeed in creating a common discursive front of the global South against the collective West? We will return to this question in the end. Before that, I will make a few notes on the context, a brief history. Since the second decade of the century, several different types of social contestation of the liberal democratic status quo have layered over one another. First came the global wave of protests from 2011 to 2014, from Occupy and Indignados to the Arab Spring, the Bolotnaya protests, Gezi, Sofia, and Euromaidan. These grassroots and essentially left-wing protests, which erupted after the financial crisis, called for more social justice, challenging the neoliberal austerity measures, and for more inclusion and democracy. Yet, the protests achieved nothing, or almost nothing. In the US, they faded without forming a political project. In Europe, Podemos and Syriza did not become a serious alternative to the status quo. In most of the Arab world, the protests led to civil wars and/or a return of dictatorship. In Turkey and Russia, they were crushed. In Ukraine, Euromaidan succeeded, and that was the greatest victory of the global protest wave. But Russia annexed Crimea and occupied part of Donbass, and 8 years later launched a full-scale war against Euromaidan. In fact, Ukraine today continues to defend its civil right to resist. However, by the middle of the second decade, the civic energy of the protests seemed to fade without the problems being resolved. Social inequalities did not decrease, and the oligarchs and autocrats in most places strengthened and expanded their power. Then came the migrant crisis of 2015, and with it the rise of right-wing populism, which is also a form of contestation against the liberal democratic order. This form of contestation, however, is somehow mirrored and perversively inverted in relation to the language of the protests. The far right somehow managed to steal and turn inside out the language of the left. They seized the issue of social inequality, promising their people not only that they would protect them from migrants, but also from global corporations and financial elites, whom they blamed for the inequalities. In doing so, they legitimized local kleptocrats, they legitimized their right to seize the economy through the state. The right wing became local kleptocrats or vice versa. The local kleptocrats became right-wing populists. But they also hijacked the issue of democracy. They promised their people that they would return the lost greatness and sovereignty to them, while simultaneously destroying civil society and the civic sector, delegitimizing them as foreign agents. In this way, the right to contest was taken away from the citizens and monopolized by the state, which was then reframed in geopolitical terms. The sovereignty against the dictate of Brussels, of the US, of NATO, of the collective West. I will skip over other important events, for example, the COVID pandemic and the outbreak of anti-vaccine and conspiracy waves, which sharply increased distrust in knowledge institutions and expertise more generally. In a nutshell, national populism turned out to be an excellent resource for capturing the state. Because by default, it proved capable of demotivating and discrediting civic activity as a form of control from within, while outside, populism blocked international oversight of state institutions. Different countries in Europe were captured by it to varying degrees. Of course, the capture of the state never happens without control over media. And here we cannot fail to highlight the specific role of the Russian Federation. Not only because during Putin's 24 years in power, Russian media were gradually but ultimately totally seized, but also because, especially after the annexation of Crimea, Russia returned with new technological tools to the good old practices of agitprop from the Cold War era. It returned to massive state propaganda, including for export abroad. And this state propaganda entered into a regime of cross-pollination and mutual reinforcement with the local right-wing populisms. In fact, it is precisely Russian propaganda in Bulgaria, in some neighborhood countries, and in Russia itself, that has been studied for 8 years by the teams of our Human and Social Studies Foundation. And I will touch on this with something like a summary of our collective results. Two things must be said right away about Russian propaganda. It is neither indigenous, nor is it, unlike Soviet propaganda, logically coherent. It is a product of postmodern bricolage. Not only because various and supposedly incomparable technical means are used to carry it out. Official media, tabloid media, media doppelgangers, anonymous media, troll factories, armies of bots, and so on. The Russian state and its associated businesses are constantly experimenting with new forms of media dissemination, generally using a trial and terror methods. What matters is the social impact. It is the same with the actors with the proponents of the Russian propaganda. The so-called wannabe journalists, politicians, ideologies of it, they are very different. And Margalotti showed this about Russia, Susanna about Germany just now. But the same postmodern bricolage applies to the propaganda content as well. Russian propagandists seem to have read and are applying the complex theory of Laclau and Mouffe on discursive hegemony as a kind of a cookbook. Let us recall their post-Marxist theory. In order for one social group to achieve dominance over another, the language of the first group must become hegemonic. It must become the language that even the second group is forced to speak. For this to happen, chains of equivalence must be built between certain concepts and realities, concepts that were originally different in their origin and meaning, so that they begin to form common messages. The hegemonic operation, which they call articulation, is precisely this: the process of forcibly reducing differences between elements of discourse and transforming them into seemingly logically connected moments of a more general discursive formation. For over a decade, Russian and pro-Russian speakers have been systematically carrying out such hegemonic articulation. They do not invent. Instead, like busy bees, they gather the pollen from various flowers to process it into propaganda honey. They eagerly collect all sorts of facts and narratives, concepts and realities, most often incommensurable with each other, to place them in a regime of a metonymic substitution, as if one can simply replace the other, as if there were no differences between them. For example, left-wing critiques of corporate capitalism developed imminently in the West are layered onto the conservative critiques of value cosmopolitism, as if there were no differences between them. After all, it is the West that's to blame, right? Everything that could undermine the West, from critiques of colonialism to any real demystification of double standards, to criticism of unforeseen consequences of the war against terror and humanitarian interventions. All of these critiques, as valid as they sometimes really are instrumentalized by Russian propaganda. After all, it is always the West that's to blame. And accordingly, everything that could glorify the image of Russia and resistance to the West is uncritically minced and absorbed in an endless metonymic substitution, as if there were no difference between Russian nationalism, the glory of the Russian Empire, nostalgia for the Soviets and internationalism, the power of the Russian army, pan-Slavism, orthodoxy, anti-fascism, heterosexuality, and Euro-Asianism. All of these are traditional values. Paradoxically, today's greatest essentialists, the supporters of traditional values, turn out to be the greatest postmodernists and constructivists in practice. The chains of equivalence that Russian propaganda builds are actually based on simple conspirational grammar. There is a big villain. In this role, the US, NATO, Brussels, the collective West, but also individuals like Soros, Obama, Merkel, etc., are metonymically placed. Who exactly will be named depends on the context. This big villain claims to uphold some universal values, liberal democracy, human rights, etc. But these values are represented just as a facade behind which the villain hides to pursue his selfish interests. The big villain, in order to keep his evil intention concealed, acts as a puppeteer, pulling the strings of his puppets, paid agents and useful idiots. In fact, all actors who, in various places and with different means, support the values of liberal democracy, civic protests, NGOs, political parties, media, and so on, are metonymically portrayed as proxies, puppets, and lackeys of the big villain. This type of propaganda is to be finally institutionalized through the Foreign Agents Act. Of course, the ones suffering from the actions of the villain are the ordinary people and nations, and their savior is Russia. Russia has supporters. The other forces from the global south, together with Russia, will break the hegemony of the West and create a just and balanced multipolar world. The described conspirational grammar creates a grand narrative, but in fact, it is a short narrative, because the grand narrative is metonymically shortened and everything can be quickly taught in its grammar through substitution. In this way, it can contain many stories within itself, each made up of sub-narratives and so on. For example, with regard to the means the big villain uses to enslave nations. First, he economically drains them through international financial institutions and regulations, through the green transitions, etc. He enslaves them militarily through NATO's expansion. He destroys them demographically with humanitarian interventions, instigating civil wars and flooding Europe with migrants. He sows the cultural poison of liberalism and gender ideology. He carries out various other conspiracies. The CIA creates viruses in biological labs like SARS-CoV-2, or on the contrary, lies about the existence of the SARS-CoV-2 in order to sell vaccines or even to implant chips in people, and so on. The variations are endless, but the contradictions between them go unnoticed. Of course, we must acknowledge that in July 2021, through a well-known article, Putin created more ideologically consolidated propaganda package for domestic use about the trillion Russian people constituting of Russians, Malo-Russians, it is Ukrainians, and Belarusians, and about the broader multi-ethnic and multi-confessional Russian world, Ruski Mir, which gravitates around the core of the trillion Russian nation. However, this package is more difficult to sell abroad. Therefore, the focus abroad is placed on criticisms on the West, on all the possible narratives that can undermine trust in liberal democracy and its principles. The Russian propaganda package, its grand short narrative, is multifaceted or even multicassetted. The individual stories in it are separate modules that can be attached or detached from the main narrative as needed by the context. The grand narrative, much like a catalog, has literally gathered within itself, like in drawers, borrowings from all kinds of disparate cultural and historical contexts. Everything that can undermine the West or praise Russia is stored in it. Moreover, the borrowings, before being stored, are maximally simplified into recipes for quick reheating. The catalog is open for free use. Anyone can reheat a quick dish by pulling out their preferred drawer. And here I return to the question from the beginning. Is it possible for the Russian propaganda package, in symbiosis with the propaganda efforts of other countries like China and Iran, to form a common discursive front of the global South against the collective West? To a large extent, this has already happened, because, as I believe will be seen many times in this conference, despite of the all-important differences in variations, despite of the difference in nuances, Chinese and Iranian state propaganda share the same general conspirational logic with Russian propaganda. The enemy, the constitutive other, is there in their case is also the West. And many other countries are playing with this language. Moreover, this language, through populism, infiltrates and infects democratic societies. The democratic alliances in various ways, from Brexit, through the alienation of the Western Balkans from EU, to the recent internal takeover of Georgia, losing its members. Perhaps even today, after Trump's victory, the US is rapidly distancing itself from us. Maybe, but I hope maybe not. So we, the West, are being corroded from the inside by pro-Russian and other anti-democratic voices. Still, the global South against the collective West front is being already actually formed, and this is most evident from the fact that we are forced to use this language. In order to resist the discursive aggression to which we are subjected, we are forced to see ourselves in geopolitical and geostrategic terms. Increasingly, we identify ourselves as we, the West, and some others, even on our own geographical spot, are identified by us as they, the East. Still not yet they, the South, but we will see. Let me remind you that just about a decade ago, geopolitics and realpolitik were relatively marginal and old-fashioned languages used most by experts in international security, while today they are the main, official and everyday mode of political articulation. But this means that Russia, which for more than a decade has been trying to reduce politics to geopolitics, to a field of state clashes, and most of all of clashes between the great powers, has won the first phase of its information war. And once it has placed us on the front line, it is right to fight back, geopolitically and strategically. We are in the war, told us Mark Galeotti in the previous session. Starting from this front, we must develop a communicative strategy that will, in the future, break this front. It should shift the lines of defense of the attack so that the discursive hegemony of the West can be restored by placing citizens and not states and blocs back at the center of the politics. And I hope that the Sofia Information Integrity Forum will strategically help achieving this goal. Thank you very much.